Okay, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for coming to this IQ talk and library science talk this afternoon. We have the pleasure to have with us Courtney Mumma, I hope I pronounce it well, yeah, from Internet Archive in the US. The topic of today is capturing moments in time, our world's memory together. Memory preservation is traditionally associated to libraries and archives. However, I think that preservation of cultural heritage is, or should be, at least everyone's concern. That's why we, the organizers, we were hoping to see also other professionals than librarians and archivists in the audience this afternoon. We'll see if we succeeded to attract other communities to this talk. From my side, a key aspect of this talk is the word distributed, collaborative. It's an important aspect, I think, of any preservation efforts of cultural heritage. First of all, two words about Courtney. Courtney Mumma joined the Internet Archive in 2015 as program manager with focus on collaborative partnerships, grant management, and community development. And her whole career is focused on building and fortifying digital cultural heritage preservation. The presentation will be followed by a panel discussion. We have the pleasure of having two qualified speakers who are going to participate into this panel. Barbara Signori, head of Helvetica in the Swiss National Library. Thank you for coming, in spite you are very busy with the organization of ePress conference in October. And Patricia Sleeman, archivist at the UNHCR, United Nations High Committee for Refugees. Thank you very much. Connie, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Tullio, for that introduction, and thank you to all of you who've come today. I'm very pleased to be here and honored, and I want to thank my hosts in particular for bringing me here to Geneva and tomorrow to Zurich. This is all very exciting for me. So as Tullio mentioned, I've been with the Internet Archive now for 1 year as a program manager, and in particular over the last couple of months my responsibilities include partnerships with national libraries. So my focus is, even more than before, focused on building partnerships on a national scale. What I do now at the archive is apropos for me. Let me tell you a bit about myself. I come from open source archives software development, in particular open source software that was made for digital preservation. And when you're doing system development, specifically open source system development, for doing digital preservation for libraries and archives and other memory institutions, something that you learn very quickly is that the thing that is core to getting work done and being successful and having sustainable success is working collaboratively and building partnerships. So the transition to the Internet Archive has been a simple one for me because it's something that I've been working on since I started my career in archives. If it matters to you, I am an archivist and a librarian in training. I was educated in Vancouver, British Columbia at the University of British Columbia there. So yes, the title of my talk is Capturing Moments in Time, Collecting Our World's Memory Together. I'm just going to scoot this. And I'll go ahead and get started. So the overview of my talk is, first I'm going to just talk a little about what we do at the Internet Archive and sort of how we've evolved doing web archiving and other work there over time. And then I'm going to talk about working together, of course, because that's something I care deeply about. So first I'll address kind of working together as with regard to working with other people and other institutions. And so I'll be talking specifically about some efforts towards coordinated collection development that we've done at the Internet Archive. Then I'm going to talk about systems, so working together as systems, so interoperability in particular, and also distributed preservation efforts. And then finally, I'm going to try to synthesize between people and systems, even though in reality, people and systems play a part in all of the things I'll be talking about today. But particularly, I'll talk about local and cloud access to digital collections, research services and how they are evolving for web archives specifically, and also new technology and new challenges and how we can better face them using all of the subject matter that I addressed today. So the Internet Archive is actually a nonprofit public library. We were founded in 1996 by Brewster Kahle, who is still the head of the organization and our head librarian. And our mandate is universal access to all knowledge. The building that you see here on the screen is actually where I work. It is an old church in San Francisco in the Richmond neighborhood, and I would like to extend to you all an invitation that if you're ever in the Bay Area, come by and visit us. And if you're there on a Friday, come to Friday lunch. We'd love to see you. Starts at noon. And you can also see any of our servers, and you can talk to people there and find out about the work that we do and get really detailed, and we'd love to have you. So the reason I show my mandate to universal access to all knowledge is because this is my next slide, and it's addressing the UN 2030 agenda. In particular, I wanted to show the parallel between the vision that the UN 2030 agenda has with our vision for that universal access. And the vision that they presented in that agenda was a world with universal literacy. So in the Sustainable Development Goal number 16, there was a specific target 1610, to ensure public access to information and protect fundamental freedoms in accordance with national legislation and international agreements. I was just recently at IFLA in Columbus, Ohio, and at that conference, many librarians from all over the world were very focused on how their libraries could address these Sustainable Development Goals, and we would like to be part of that. So we are going to make efforts to align what we're doing with what other national libraries and institutions are doing to work towards these goals. So in the Internet Archive, towards this end, we currently have 30 petabytes archived, and that covers everything. That's not just our web archives. It's a lot. We do books digitization. So with regard to books, we scan about 1,000 books per day. We have 33 scanning centers all over the world on 5 continents, and we've just opened a new one in China in particular. And we're working to get more books available, especially because we provide derivatives, especially for the vision and hearing impaired. And for those of you familiar with the Marrakesh Agreement, we would very much like to be a part of that and provide greater access to library content over time. So we want to scan as much as possible. We do music digitization. So we have a lot of music on the archive. If you go to archive.org, you'll find music from live concerts. We started with the Grateful Dead, if any of you are familiar, which is, again, appropriate because we're from the Bay Area. And you can listen to music there also from CDs. And we've just started a project archiving 78s, so old 78 records. We have a very large TV collection, so that television is actually a citable source now for researchers. We have television news. We have a project for political ads, which of course is extremely pertinent right now with the US presidential election. And we're recently just started branching out even beyond TV into streamed radio. We have a lot of emulated software on the internet, on the Internet Archive page. So Jason Scott, if you're familiar with him, he's kind of well known, at least in North America, for providing these emulated environments so that you can play games that seem to have disappeared. But we also have other things beyond games. We have operating systems available that you can view in an emulated environment and navigate. And we also have the documentation from that software scanned and available on the archive to view. Sorry. So in all, we have 25,000 software titles. I won't go through all of these numbers. You can see them in front of you. But quite a lot of moving images, a lot of books, and that's growing rapidly. Audio recordings, many hours of television, and of course 4 million ebooks so far, but we plan to grow that. But specifically what we want to focus on, I think, today is the 500 billion plus URLs, so that number is always growing. We are the largest publicly available web archive in existence. This is not an exhaustive list of what we have to offer either, so if you get a chance, go to archive.org and take a look at what we have there. We really focus on access. So we have been archiving the web for 20 years. And what's very exciting for us is that we're actually having an anniversary celebration this October. It'll be a big event. You'll probably see lots of press about it and many blog posts. So I'm going to walk through just some of the evolution of what we've been doing. So we started in 1996. Brewster founded the Internet Archive with US presidential campaigns, and he was archiving those in partnership with the Smithsonian. Then in 1997, we did our first full crawl, which is quite different actually than the kinds of crawls that we do now, but I'll go into more detail about that. In 1998, we donated a crawl to the Library of Congress so that they could preserve it there in the library. And then in 2000, we did the US presidential campaigns in partnership again with the Library of Congress. And we also started collecting our television archive and then also digitizing movies. One of the things, of course, I didn't mention was that we have many movies available. In 2001, we launched the Wayback Machine, with which many of you are probably familiar. Often when I say where I work, it's not until I mention the Wayback Machine that people understand what I do and where I work. And then in 2002 is when we actually started our book digitization. 2003, we partnered to help form the International Internet Preservation Coalition, the IIPC, with whom we are still partners in many ways and still actively involved. And then in 2006, we started Archive It, which is our preservation service that allows institutions to build collections of websites over time, and they can provide metadata for these collections, and they're searchable. It's a much kind of deeper crawl, and I'll talk more about it in a few minutes. We did a domain crawl for Ireland then in 2007, which was one of the first of our national projects, and I'll talk more about those in a moment as well. 2008, we worked with the National Archive and Records Administration in the United States to work on their government crawls, so basically the Congress, Senate, and House, and those are still something that we do. In fact, there's one that we just started a week ago. So Archive It started growing really rapidly, and so in 2009 we added our 100th partner, and by then we had 7 national library partners. And then in 2010, this is when we started a different kind of crawling, which I'll go in more detail about shortly. But it's our broad and survey web scale crawling, which is more similar to what we do now than what we started doing early on. It's also the year, I put a capture up here of WikiLeaks, because 2010 is the same year that Julian Assange was arrested. In 2012, the Australian National Library partnered with us, and we did crawling with them. And then in 2014 is when Jason Scott started doing our emulation software. And what's pictured here is Oregon Trail, which you might not be familiar with, but it's very popular in North America. And it's amazing because as soon as we started providing access to it on the Internet Archive, teachers started using it to teach history in courses, which was very surprising to us, but we're very excited about it, of course. In 2015, Archive It added its 400th partner, and so that was just last year, and now we're well on our way to 500 partners with Archive It. But of course, what most people are familiar with is the Wayback Machine. Our focus at the Internet Archive has always really been on this and on access to, and replay of materials. So this is kind of the way that most people interact with the archive and use the archive. We also support open source software. So the software that we use to do our crawls that are available in the Wayback Machine is Heritrix, and that is open source software. It's also Wayback is also provided through Open Wayback, and so many institutions use Open Wayback as the version of the Wayback that they use to provide access to their own web archive crawls. And so I want to talk a little bit more detail about the kinds of crawling that we do with for the Wayback Machine. And this is what I was saying earlier when I was explaining how the way that we crawl has evolved over time. So the global Wayback has one broad snapshot that we do. Generally, 1 billion URLs per week are crawled with that one. We also do a deep crawl on popular sites. We do a broad crawl on known domains as well. And we also take donations of crawls. For a long time, in fact, that was most of the content of the archive were donated crawls. And we do targeted crawls, so around events and other activities, which I'll talk a little bit more later. We also have on-demand crawling. So this is a little shot blown up from the Wayback Machine page. It's called Save Page Now, and that allows you to select a site and save it on the fly. And then we also have a project called No More 404s, and what that means is we're trying to fix the broken and rotten links on the web. The average website only lasts about 100 days, according to some studies. And so what we've done is we've partnered with Firefox to create an add-on that allows you to go to a site, and if you find a 404, you can see whether it's in the Internet Archive, whether we have it provided in the Wayback Machine. We also, through the No More 404s project, we've got partnerships actively with Wikipedia and WordPress so that we can provide links to citations that have broken in those sites. Okay, so now I'm going to get into starting to talk about working together and how we can work together better. So we have lots of different kinds of web archiving partnerships and services, and of course that's the focus of what I do at the archive. The first that I'm going to talk about just very briefly is our domain scale web preservation. And in particular, I'll talk about our contract crawling efforts. So we run contract crawls for national organizations, national libraries, national archives. Generally around 300 million URLs for each of these projects, for each of these collections. This is just a very short list of current partners, the national libraries of both Australia and New Zealand, the US National Archives, as well as the Library of Congress, and the National Libraries of Luxembourg and Israel. And then outside of national libraries and domain crawling, we also do targeted subject matter crawling for partners. And so a partial list of these is the Iraq War from 2003 to 2011, the 2005 US Supreme Court nominations, and the Australian domain, of course, which we did until 2011 and are resuming it actually again this year. Archive It, however, offers kind of a next level of curated selective web archiving. Archive It is our system that allows for partners, libraries, archives, museums, to select the URLs which they would like to crawl, how frequently they would like to crawl them, and other details, and provide metadata, and it's indexed. So it's web-based. There's an application that they can use that's fully hosted and supported by us. We provide access to the content that they crawl, and as well as storage, of course, in the Internet Archive and duplication. Partners can select and manage and scope out their crawls, and then, of course, catalog it with metadata. There are 10 different crawl frequencies, so daily, weekly, monthly, etc. You can capture, of course, HTML, but other content, videos, audio, social networking content. Of course, that's more challenging. PDFs, images, and news has been a focus for many of our partners as well. And then the archives that they crawl are available 24 hours after a capture is complete, and then searchable, a full text search is available within 7 days. And we also offer restricted access to collections, so really partners have the power to decide whether those will be restricted or not. So this is what the interface looks like in the web application. Pretty basic. This is the crawl overview, so this is kind of deep down in the web application once you've decided on your crawl and you're specifying, you're looking at how it went. And this one in particular got 1.5 gigabytes and 26,377 documents. This, of course, is the public interface. So if you go to archiveit.org, this is where all of the collections are searchable together. And then if you drill down into a particular collection, you can look at a particular, this is the Innsbruck newspaper archive at the University of Innsbruck. And so you can look through this and click on anything that they've archived, and you've got faceted searching available here as well. And it's, again, full text indexed. So our partners are pretty diverse. They work with Archiveit basically to, for instance, if it's a state archives, they work with agencies within that state to determine what they need to archive, what publications are important. But generally, they also try to enhance and supplement traditional offline collections. So if they have an analog library or an analog archives, they try to supplement that with their web archives. It also supports records retention policies in many places. A lot of Archiveit partners try to collaborate with other institutions and share the work that they're doing, and this is happening more and more. Of course, we're happy to see that. And then they also, and I'm going to go more into this subject, collaborate with subject specialists in particular to capture kind of at-risk digital content on a spontaneous event. And this is what we call spontaneous web archiving. And this is something that started for us in 2007. And this is for this web content that's at risk, events that are occurring, tragedies often, unfortunately. And these kinds of events, as their activities on the web come about, they disappear very quickly as they unfold and develop. Usually they're global in scope, and usually they have global implications and impact. And that's important to note because one of the challenges we face, which I'll talk about a little bit, is that we don't always get all of the collaborators that we want. So we don't get all of the curators helping us globally. We might just have local collaborators to build a collection that has global impact. So that's problematic for a lot of reasons, as you might imagine. So basically, we collect seeds, we collect websites for these collections of spontaneous events, and then we make them all publicly available. These are some examples of just some of the ones that we've done. There was the shooting at Virginia Tech in 2007, things like the Jasmine Revolution and the revolution in Egypt in 2011. More recently, the Orlando shootings, the Pulse shootings at the Pulse nightclub in 2016. I'm going to show just a few examples from the Japan tsunami in 2011. So this is the collection we did with the Virginia Tech, who are Archiveit partners, and they collect quite a few kind of tragic events in their crisis collection. And so this was BBC coverage of the earthquake that the Virginia Tech Crisis Tragedy and Recovery Network collected. And this is an example from that collection of dynamically created content. So this is important because using Archiveit, they're able to capture this frequently, so you can actually view over time the changes in impact. So this would show the seismic activity in Japan over the last 30 days, but you would be able, since it's archived, you can actually go back and look at that, while on the live web, it's just updated constantly with dynamic content. And then one other benefit of this collection is that you can look at before and after imagery. So before imagery can be really useful in rebuilding. The after imagery can be really useful in seeing recovery and seeing the effects of recovery as well. And then, of course, many images and videos which existed during the crisis disappeared very rapidly afterwards. And so they're preserved in these collections. An example of something that's disappeared, although I could show you many of these examples, this website that is a report of the earthquake was no longer found very shortly after. So we were happy that we were able to capture it with Virginia Tech, and it's now in their collection. So these spontaneous events, they started as these spontaneous events, but now we're really trying to start to think about, let's make this more focused and something that we do proactively, where we're building collaborative collections together. So what we want to do is pair subject expertise with technical expertise, which we have. Of course, we have many subject experts as well at the archive, but with these kinds of events, you never really know what kind of experts you're going to need to help you curate the content. So we need subject matter experts. An example of that is this 2014 Congressional Election Cycle collection, and that something that we built with subject matter experts at Stanford and UC Berkeley. We tried to work actively with concurrent projects. So there was a project called Documenting Ferguson at Washington University in St. Louis, and they helped us create the Black Lives Matter web archive. Black Lives Matter is an effort in the United States currently. We partner with local experts, especially when those local experts are across the Atlantic. So for the Charlie Hebdo attacks, we worked with members of the IIPC, and especially we got lots of contributions from the National Library in France to build that collection with us. And then we also tried to crowdsource collecting. So the 2013 government shutdown in the United States is a good example of this. We called for submissions to this archive using Facebook and Twitter, which is something that we also do now for the Pulse nightclub event. For example, we put out a call on Facebook and Twitter, and then we actually use Google Forms for submissions now. And so we're trying to really get a structure in place for getting these collaborations going. So some of the challenges we face with these spontaneous and collaborative collections are that they're inherently ad hoc, of course. It's difficult, as I was saying, to find the appropriate curators, to find the right people to let us know what we should be collecting around these events. You have to act quickly. These websites change very quickly. And it's also very difficult because we're doing it locally at the Internet Archive and it's kind of off the side of the desk. Quality assurance is something that we need help with. So we need curators who can not only provide us with sites that we should be archiving for these collections, but also letting us know if we're doing a good job and helping us providing the best kind of access and also doing data analysis of this. So now I'm going to talk a little bit about systems working together, interoperability in particular, and distributed preservation. So usually, or always, that means talking about APIs, so application programming interfaces if you're not familiar with them. The benefits of APIs are many, but these are some of the highlights. Interoperability between systems, flexibility and modularity between systems, loose coupling of services when they're modular. That means we can improve pieces without impacting the entire system or systems, or at least not impacting them too badly immediately. And then APIs are good for scalability as well. They allow for bulk data upload and download. So the ability, for instance, for partners or users of web archiving systems to download their own content and preserve it locally. So these are just some systems, but I just wanted to illustrate the universe of systems out there. And all of these systems have one or more APIs built on them. And I'll go into why that's great and why it's also not enough just to have an API that is built. We need examples of these systems working together using their APIs. We need to show that what you can do when you have APIs and show how we can integrate these systems. We need use cases. So some of the challenges in building APIs and getting systems to interoperate the way that we would like to see are that web archives are not usually integrated into infrastructure that's provided for digital initiatives. So infrastructure is usually dedicated to digital repositories, digital archives, digital libraries, and that doesn't necessarily always include web archives. In fact, more often than not, it's not included. Many people who are doing web archiving at all are reliant on just a few tools or a few partners and limited to that, and it's not integrated into their other work. There's also coordination of all of these emergent efforts aren't really coordinated with each other. So all of these different systems that are building APIs are doing it in a silo without talking to other systems that their users are probably also using. So that's that lack of foresight that I mentioned here. There's a lack of foresight about interoperability and which systems these APIs need to serve. So to illustrate this, there's a lot of talk of walls in the US right now. So instead of walls, I'm showing not walled gardens, but a labyrinth. This is a scene from the 1986 movie Labyrinth. Any of you old enough to know what that was? Great. But I just wanted to illustrate here, it's a maze because nothing is shut off. All of these different access systems and content management systems and storage systems and web archiving tools, they all have APIs. So they're all, capable of working together. But it's very difficult when you don't see it in action. It's very difficult to get them to elegantly work together, let's say. APIs really help with building community. So this is, again, even though I'm talking about systems, it's still people. When you have APIs and when you show examples of them working together, people are able to collaborate better. You're able to compare and contrast your work. So if you're using one system over here and the Internet Archive is using a system for web archiving, if you have good APIs and you show how they can be used together, then you should be able to synthesize those and actually see, okay, we duplicated each other, but that's actually valuable because I had these crawl parameters and you had these crawl parameters, and now let's see how that's different and why that's different. And that could be very important to researchers over time. It also, again, as I mentioned before, it allows for local preservation and ingest of works, which is, of course, the preservation format for web archives. And that's important. At the Internet Archive, we're satisfied, of course, that we have excellent storage and preservation, and it's replicated. But we would really love to see institutions preserving their own web archives locally, just because it's best practice to do so. And we would like it to see it more integrated into their local programs. And then it also, once you have good APIs that work together, it broadens the options for use. So it allows for really cool projects around data mining and bulk access and federated browsing and that sort of thing. There's a lot of work going on in this in the States. This is just, believe it or not, a small sampling. There are CDX server, which are the WARC index files. So there are APIs on those. The Internet Archive and IIPC has done work there. Archive.it and the British Library have done work around derivative formats, and APIs help to generate those for researchers, which I'll go into a bit more. There are APIs on our crawl logs and partner data in Archive.it. There are current projects to make those better right now, too. There are many APIs on the Wayback Machine, and many of them are being used, which is very exciting, but we'd love to see more. There's a current project right now called WASAPI in the United States, funded by the US IMLS. It was a national leadership grant, and WASAPI means Web Archiving Services APIs. And that's with Stanford, Rutgers, University of North Texas, LOCKSS, Lots of Copies, Keep Stuff Safe system, and then, of course, us, Internet Archive, is the PI on the project. And that's really focused on two things: APIs for works, so that people are taking their works locally and preserving them, but also building community. And the community in particular that we're interested in building is a community that wants to integrate API work. So we want APIs that work together between systems. We want people to tell us use cases about what systems they're using and what they want to be able to do between all of those systems. We've also got a project, a Mellon grant, with NYU in the Internet Archive that's called Archiving Contemporary Composers, and that's working on an API with a system called Archive Space, which is for archives management and administration. And then, of course, many of you are probably already familiar with Memento and their time travel APIs that allow you to see basically changes in a website over time, kind of on a timeline. And so now I want to move into transition more to talking about people's interaction with archives, in particular talking about access and use and research use cases for web archives. So we want to focus on use for a lot of reasons. The first of which is that, of course, web archives are meaningful historical records. And unfortunately, that's not accepted in all libraries and archives yet, although it should probably be at this point. There's a diversity of content types, including born digital resources across time that are captured in web archives. So not just the HTML itself, but also everything that's embedded in them has archival value. And then they're just rich sources for data mining because there's so much of them and there's so much in that work file. Current access modules are okay, but not great. For instance, with the Wayback Machine, you still have to use you have to know the URL and plug it into the Wayback. Of course, we have a project right now to make that better, and we've just released a beta version of the Wayback that allows for text search. That's very exciting, but it's still a little while off before that's something that's public and, as infallible as we would like it to be. And then, of course, there's some indexing and query-based retrieval based on APIs. But currently, it's still sort of siloed. And also, use in general is really not measured as much as we would like it to be at this point. We need to do more where we're reaching out to researchers and finding out how they want to use web archives. So we know that researchers want data, and web archives have a lot of data. Their researchers are interested in change over time, and there are ways that we can show that kind of change in web archives because they're segmented due to the nature of the preservation format. Researchers want to study entities, semantics, locations, and web archives have this rich diversity of content. Both researchers and web archives are multidisciplinary in nature, and researchers really value information about provenance, collection origins. Web archives have lots of provenance information, maybe too much at this point because we don't have enough use cases illustrating what kind of provenance we need to show. So we have multiple partnerships right now that we are currently engaged in or have been engaged in the past. We have new partnerships building all the time with researchers. They're very diverse in nature, so we'll sometimes provide the totality of a domain to researchers so that they can explore that domain. Sometimes we'll provide cyber infrastructure so that they can analyze preloaded data on a computing cluster so that they don't need that very high level of computing locally. Sometimes we have many hackathons that we've participated in recently, especially over the last couple of years, where we provide derivatives so that people can use derivatives to perform visualization and other types of data analysis work. And we're doing this because we want to find out how researchers want to use the web archive data so that we can make our tools better and make our APIs better. Of course, there are challenges, and we've discovered that they are really two kinds in nature. There are technical and conceptual changes. The technical are that the work format in and of itself is complex and varied. So each work looks very different from the last work. Captures are also different, so depending on what system you're using, or even if you're using the same system, the parameters that guide that crawling can vary. There's so much data that it requires a lot of infrastructure, computational and storage infrastructure. And luckily at the Internet Archive we have that, but most institutions locally do not. And of course there are always those copyright and IP problems. So access to full content can often be very problematic. The conceptual changes are, again, around this idea of acquisition. What should be acquired? How should we acquire it? Who is acquiring it? The problems of provenance I just touched on a minute ago. The idea that researchers want to know where it came from, but what that means can vary in any given situation, and it can vary per discipline. So depending on the kind of research that an institution, that a researcher is doing, the web is never-ending, huge, changing. It's crawled differently, and researchers often want to know the configuration of the crawl that's important to them towards their research. It has value, and we don't have great ways to provide it as yet. The web is, of course, a moving target. There's this idea from researchers often that more data is better. What we've actually found through some of our work with researchers is that more data isn't necessarily better. We are really hoping for more curated data that's more focused so that we can build collections that are more meaningful. And there's this higher sensitivity to elision than in traditional archives. And I think that's because this idea that more data is better data. So with Archive.it, we've started something called Archive.it Research Services, and this is because of what we learned working directly with researchers. It's kind of the next step in the process. It's the ability to actually hand some content over to researchers from Archive.it collections, because those collections, of course, unlike Wayback collections, have a lot more metadata and have been curated quite a bit. And so for researchers, these are very valuable. What we're trying to do is enable kind of new views into collections for researchers by giving them data in these different formats that aren't as big or vast as works, that are more focused so that they can have more meaningful data sets. We have three kinds of data sets that we provide from works that are much smaller than works. The WAT is a web archive transformation, which offers key metadata from every resource in the work file. LGA, which are longitudinal graph analysis, so that's a way to look at what links to what over time. And then WAIN datasets, which are web archive named entities. So these are your subject people, places, and organizations. And this is just to show kind of what you can do with these. So the WATs, you can do all kinds of stuff. You can hand them to researchers to do text mining, hyperlink analysis, looking into provenance and the history of a collection over time. And with WATs, researchers can also select a segment of WATs from a collection, or which collection between particular dates that they would like to look at. And you'll see in the percentages here at the bottom, that's how much smaller they are than works. So it's much better for large-scale computational analysis. This is just an example of some research that Ian Mulligan, a researcher, historian in Canada, did using WATs from the Canadian Political Interests Group's collection. And there's actually a really great illustration online. There's a YouTube video that if any of you want to see, I'll give you a link. But it's really cool over time. You can see it, it's this example of the way you can really visualize data using these derivatives. And then this is an example of the named entities in the human rights collection in Archive.it. So you'll see it's pointing out Barack Obama and Julian Assange and George Bush. And so this is a really great way to drill down into a collection and get more information about it. And this is not the only way that you can see it. You can use other tools to interact, of course, with these derivatives. And that's what we want to see, is more researchers using them, how they want to use them, and what kind of research they want to do. So we want to give more data sets to researchers. We want more use cases. We want to make it so people don't have to be limited by whatever their infrastructure is, so that they can use computational environments that either we can provide or partner with large-scale computation providers. We want to hide really how complex these things are and make it easier to interact with them, so researchers actually do use them and interact with them on a larger scale. And of course, this has to do with the work in our APIs. It's all related. So finally, and I'm wrapping up, I wanted to talk about this kind of synthesis between people and technology, and building new technology together to face the new kinds of challenges that we're facing with the web. Because the web just keeps getting more complex and bigger, and it's not going to stop anytime soon. The way we interact with it is changing. Most of us interact very frequently on our phones with the web, for instance. Archiving is just harder now, and it's going to keep getting harder. This is a scene from the movie Minority Report, a Tom Cruise film some of you may have seen, where he's walking into a building, and when Tom Cruise's character, John Anderton, walks into a building, the building itself recognizes him and says, good evening, are you stressed out? Would you like a Guinness? This is the world that we are very much in reality living in now and certainly into the future. So how do we capture this? How do we preserve this over time? And how do we work together to do it? Right now, we're faced especially with social media challenges. So many of the emerging projects, especially in North America, are focused around collecting social media. It's just, I hate to end on a note of how hard it is, but it's still a niche collecting activity. As I've mentioned several times in my talk, web archiving is still something that not all institutions who are dedicated to memory preservation believe is included in their mandate. There aren't a lot of coordinated efforts on shared tools. So again, you have tools and APIs being developed in silos. There's still very little familiarity with the formats and the software and the processes that are used for web archiving across the board in the library and archives professions in particular. And despite the fact that many of the software is open source, there are not many on-ramps for developer and non-developer participation. So while you have many of the people who are producing systems and working on projects, screaming for participation, it's not easy to do so for people. And often if it's not easy for people to participate, they're not as likely to do so. So some of the ongoing efforts, to end on a high note, are, of course, the Open Wayback Machine, and that's still being developed over time, and there are lots of people working on that. I mentioned social media being a massive challenge, and in particular at the Internet Archive, we've been using something called Umbra in addition to Heritrix. It's also open source software, and that helps us capture quite a lot of dynamic and social media content. And right now we're working on an additional crawler called Browsler. It's browser plus crawler equals Browsler. And Browsler it's making it better not only to capture dynamic content, but it's allowing us to capture a lot more of these social media site challenges that we've had even with Umbra. There's an effort in the United States called Documenting the Now that's looking at collections of social media, in particular Twitter, and looking at the ethics of that and how archivists can collect social media ethically. And then, of course, Social Feed Manager, which is looking at Twitter in particular, and that's at GWU, and we've been working with them on that as well to collect mostly Twitter content. And the University of North Texas has had a great nomination tool. So this is towards that idea of collaborative collection development. Their tool is really fantastic. We've used it in the end of term collection, which is at the end of presidential terms in the US, many partners, including the Library of Congress and Internet Archive, get together to crowdsource seeds for the end of term collection. It's a really great collaborative effort, and the University of North Texas, who's been doing their own web archiving for quite a long time, provided this really cool tool for that project, and now they're working to make that tool even better so that people can start nominating and we can broaden that sea of curators towards making these collections better. There are lots of different capture tools coming out. So outside of what we're doing at the Internet Archive, GWU is, of course, working on Social Feed Manager and other tools, and Rhizome in New York has been working on several different tools as well. We've got the Wasabi project that's ongoing. In fact, we're having a national symposium for that project to build the community even further. We'll have our WARC API ready by February when we have our national symposium hosted at the Internet Archive in California. And then, of course, Memento is always being developed further and has been adopted further by many more systems over time and continues to be. So that's how I'll close, because I think it's very encouraging that we have so many of these projects acknowledging the changes that we're facing and the challenges. So let's do this together. Let's make web archiving better. That's what I do, is try to build partnerships. We have a lot of different inroads to work together. So if you have ideas, please talk to me afterwards. Again, I'm really excited to be here, and I want to thank all of you for listening today in the afternoon. And I'll take some questions, I guess. Oh, fantastic. Okay. Thank you.
Okay. Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks again for coming. I'm Bree Grenoble. I'm the Digital Collections Librarian at ITU. And I'm really pleased to welcome Patricia Sleeman of UNHCR and Barbara Signori of the Swiss National Library to the podium to have a brief panel discussion where we'll have an opportunity to hear from two people who are in their institutions working actively to archive web content. So if the panelist wants to join me up here. Patricia, maybe you can come to the...
This should be okay, right? Do you want to be here? Could we be sitting here? I don't think she's going to say it. Okay.
Okay, now we've organized ourselves. I think we'll begin with Barbara. If you can give a brief introduction to what you're doing at the Swiss National Library. Barbara is the head of eHelvetica, which in that department handles web archiving for the Swiss National Library. If you can tell us a little bit about the projects you're working on, when the Swiss National Library started doing web archiving, and also what types of content are you capturing?
Yeah. Hello, everyone. At the Swiss National Library, actually, we started in 2003 to think about web archiving. In the department I'm working, which is called eHelvetica, we collect not only websites, but also e-books, e-journals, e-theses, so we really cope with the whole digital collection. And we started, as I said early, in 2003, to think what should we do with the web content. And with all the other collections we are building, we knew very soon that we don't want to do it on our own, but we always looked for collaborations. And that's why we contacted the canton libraries. As you all know, in Switzerland we have 26 cantons, so everyone has its canton library who is responsible for collecting and keeping the publications that are being published within a canton. So it's similar to the National Library, but we have a mandate on a national level and the cantonal libraries on the cantonal level. So we met in 2003 talking about how could we do web archiving together in Switzerland. And the directors were very interested, and we started a project in 2005 where we started to test, to crawl, to set selection criteria, to define how we want to catalog those websites. And the project took about 3 years. And in 2008, in May 2008, we started with Web Archive Switzerland. That's when we started with 11 partners, and within the year it was growing, so more canton libraries joined us. And at the moment, Web Archive Switzerland has 30 partners. So it went beyond the canton libraries, but we do have partners like the social archives in Zurich, or the literary archives in Bern, or the Wirtschaftsarchiv in Basel. So also archives that are focusing on a specific topic that collaborate to Web Archive Switzerland. And the idea is that actually they do the selection, because from the Swiss National Library we said we're a small team working on the digital collection, and we said they have the competences to know what is important to be collected, what is important on the web, because we always knew we have to do a selective crawl. We don't have a legal deposit in Switzerland, not even for printed material and not for digital material either. So we knew we're not going to do a domain crawl, but we're doing a selective crawl. And those partners were best to know and are best to know what is actually important in their topics or in their region. And that's how it all started. So now it's 8 years, and soon in 2018 we have also our 10th anniversary, which we hopefully are going to celebrate. The collection is very small compared to the numbers we heard from the Internet Archive, of course. We have more than 6,000 titles, so URLs in the collection, and snapshots we have over 20,000. And it's about 10 terabytes, but so it's really small. But it's a bit like Switzerland. We are used to these numbers. And our first crawl was actually started before 2008. It was the elections of 2007. So this is the oldest collection we have in Web Archive Switzerland. And we are also an IAPC member, of course, and that's why we use the open source tools that are being developed within IAPC, with this consortia. So we use Heritrix, we use the Wayback, and we also participate in those spontaneous crawls Courtney mentioned, like Charlie Hebdo or whatever. So every country really selects the websites to this spontaneous target happening where we participate as well. And one thing Courtney mentioned is really at the National Library, we started very early that we are integrating, as I said in the beginning, the web archive into our digital collection. So we use the same ingest system for ingesting the websites. We use the ARC files. And we also catalog them, so they are in our library catalog. So you find ebooks, you find a website in the catalog. And also in our access system, you can search for a website, for an e-journal. So we really try to integrate and promote, propose the whole collection to the users. Yeah, I think this gives some sort of overview, and then...
Okay, I think it's a really good and interesting overview. And now I'll turn to Patricia Sleeman, who's the digital archivist at UNHCR, to talk a little bit about the project that she's been working on, how it started, and also the types of content that you're trying to capture.
So now for something completely different. We are a very small team in UNHCR, in the archives team. We are 3 archivists. One is working on the reference section, one is a records manager, and I'm the digital archivist. Until this year, I was working on records management. So if I can go back to when I started work at UNHCR in 2013, one of my first jobs was working on the electronic documents records management system and the implementation of that worldwide in UNHCR. UNHCR has is a very global workforce of 7,000 people. We have offices all around the world. Our main work is in the field. So one of the first projects I was doing was working on a business case to implement a global rollout of our EDRMS. So we went on mission to Lebanon and Iraq to understand what specifically in the Syria and Iraq situations, in the Syria-Iraq emergency, what our staff members needed in terms of information management. So in light of that, we got the money for the implementation of this project. We saw when we were in the field the degree that social media was being used in the field for public awareness, public information, for reflection, for spreading the word about the organization in general, as well as websites. So we decided to invest part of the money we got for this global rollout of our EDRMS into web archiving. We had a tiny bit. We had to make the case for it. And so that is how our web archiving project started last year, when we got our money for our EDRMS global rollout as well. So since December 2015, we have been archiving selected sites that are all UNHCR websites. The primary sites are our main multilingual websites, and social media being Twitter and YouTube. So we are a very tiny team for such a massive workforce, but we believe passionately in documenting emergencies, and we've come up with this model that we hope will work so that we can document in real time through staff members' information management system and through web archiving and emergency. So we decided to outsource the service, because we are so few, to a company called the Internet Memory Foundation. This project is very much a pilot, so it's 3 years to see how it will go. But because of the dramatic change of events in terms of Syria and Iraq and how big it's become, and UNHCR has never known a crisis like this. It's a watershed moment in the history of UNHCR. We decided that it was an important part of the project to document the web. This site is actually one of the sites that we are capturing. It's very much one of the reasons we're doing this is both for operational support and historical support. But it's for the people who we are serving, who are people of concern, and refugees are developing a lot of the content that we're capturing. And this is a site called the Refugee Photo Project that was done in various camps in Lebanon, Iraq, and Jordan, where refugees were taking photographs and uploading them, developing their own portfolio. Within a month of capturing this site, it was gone. So, and it was a very important site for these people. I was sad it was gone, but I was delighted we got it in the web archive. And so we are really trying to capture these stories that are coming from the field, that are personalizing the situation that people are going through, personalizing people of concern and documenting their stories. That's very important to us. We call it the most urgent story of our time. I'm not going to go into detail. The current refugee crisis, and UNHCR has seen various crises that have been watershed moments in the history of UNHCR, World War II being the reason it was founded, because of the refugee crisis after World War II, and it was thought that it would fold up and would finish its work, but of course it didn't. Vietnam, the Balkans, and now Syria were also watershed moments. We're currently working on the Balkans crisis paper collection now, 20 years later. So we thought it was important to capture the Syrian Iraq crisis because it is a purely digital emergency in the way it's been documented. So if we didn't capture it now, we would probably lose it. This is an overview of what we're anticipating to do. We're selecting the content, capturing it, using the staff. They upload to our system, which is our EDRMS, and we capture it in a server here in Geneva. So in a sense, we're rationalizing and protecting this information, normalizing it. Part of the strategy is the web archive. And then we are aiming to procure a long-term preservation system in 2017. How we will work this in with our web archive, which is in the cloud. We have to figure that out in the long term, but we thought that it was not good to wait. We had to capture it the sooner the better. And that's UNHCR's first webpage, thanks to the Wayback Machine and the Internet Archive. We have a lot of content there, which is great. So we also make sure that all our content is catalogued in the same system, which is AdLib. So we catalogue the web archive in AdLib. As I said, we've been doing this since 2015. It's been very interesting. Management like the idea of it. There are challenges, but we are happy with what we're collecting. We are very interested in collaborating because I think sustainability of this project is difficult for us because we're so small in terms of the archive team. So I think I've covered most of what I need to cover there.
Okay, one of the things, Patricia, you just mentioned that there are challenges, and Courtney addressed a few of them. And I wondered if Barbara and Patricia, if you could both, we'll start with Barbara, speak about some of what you found are the most challenging aspects of getting a web archiving project sort of off the ground, maintaining it, and turning it into a sustainable project. What are the challenges, and maybe how you faced those challenges, if you've come to some solutions?
Mm-hmm. Well, there are many challenges, as you can imagine. So if I go back when we started, I think when Courtney mentioned it before as well, was really also to convince the management that this is important, that this stuff on the web is important, it's part of our digital heritage. So that was sort of a little fight to get that in not in our national library, but also for the canton libraries, because it's something, if you start doing it, you should continue doing it, because otherwise, I mean, a web archive is only gets interesting in the years, right? When it grows, and when you have the more snapshots over the years you have. So if you start it, you should continue doing it. Otherwise, the collection and the data and the resources you put into it is maybe not used. Can I get that question directly? Or?
Sure, go ahead with your question.
There seems to be a bit of an implicit assumption in some of what you're saying, is that once something has been archived, it's safe. Is that really the case, or is it just less vulnerable to being rewritten, forgotten, just lost or obsolete? What does the panel think about that? Because some of what you said, thank goodness we were able to get it, we've got it, it's archived. But does that mean that it's necessarily really safe for the future?
Should I reply?
Sure.
Well, at least we have stored it for the moment. And then, of course, there are questions about preservation, long-term preservation actions that you have to take to keep your archive, your web archive, also over the years, and to keep the data accessible. And that is still a challenge, but many of us, so the whole IPC group and others, are facing, and there's lots of research being done. I'm pretty sure that we are going to succeed in keeping those web archives alive. But the most important is that you capture, that you crawl the content now, and don't wait until you really have all the solutions for long-term preservation already, because the data won't be there anymore. So you really have to capture now, you have to collect now. And all the issues about access, which is an issue in our library, and long-term preservation will follow for sure. Another challenge, which is important, is that when you start, it's new skills you need to develop. So it's the whole crawling, which is called crawl engineer. So really, it's something new you have to learn. Maybe now, it wasn't in 2005 or 3, there were no schools or no courses to do that. So it was really hands-on experience. And now, of course, almost 10 years later, we learned a lot. But you could see in the crawls we did, we improved really a lot, and also the crawlers improved. So this is sort of an evolution. But not only the technical skills, but also for librarians, it's new skills. At least for a national library, it was, suddenly we had to select. We had to say what is important and what is not important. And a national library, normally we didn't do that, because everything that's Swiss, we collect. We had some formal criteria. It has to be more than 6 pages or things like these, but that doesn't apply to the web anymore. So suddenly we had to evaluate. We had to say what is important, what is worth to be kept. And that also took some time for the librarians to dare, to take this responsibility to say this website is important, so we keep it for forever, and this one maybe less. So that's something you have to learn. And then, of course, the other challenge is resources in general, because it takes a lot of resources, human resources, but also storage, so costs involved. Maybe to just mention 3.
Yeah, all really good examples. I think one thing that I think of often is how do you make a selection, and what are your criteria for choosing web content to capture and to catalog and describe and store. So maybe Patricia, is that something you could give some insights onto? How do you choose what? Because I imagine UNHCR is creating a lot of content. How do you choose those important pieces that you want to capture?
So I'm focusing on the Syria and Iraq situation, as that's where I've been working mainly. Many other projects, I work in digitization and digital preservation and records management. But so focusing on the web archiving, we are focusing on that particular emergency for now. So that was one criteria. But in addition to this, we were focusing on the main multilingual sites. And then we're working on different websites that are outside of the Syria-Iraq situation because we thought we should have a more complete capture. So practically what I did was I came up with a list. I look in Twitter who's very active in tweeting. Twitter is very, very important for us in the field as a communication tool for people of concern, for information to the public. And it captures events and moments that you don't get anywhere else. So then I work with our digital engagement team in UNHCR who are responsible for all this content in many ways. And they a group of 5 of us and come together and we look at the list and they will say, well, yes, we think that's a good site, or that's a good person, or they're very active. And then we the archives work with them in terms of what we're going to crawl, what we can afford, because money is very tight at UNHCR. Every time I go and meet my director, well, every time, when I've gone to talk to him about various projects I'm working on, digitization, digital preservation, web archiving, he has on his desk this bar called the Plumpy Nut Bar. Does anybody know what that is? It's a high nutrition bar for feeding children who are basically dying, who arrive in camps, particularly in Africa. And he says, what can you give me of value that's equivalent to this? And this is very hard. So everything we have to fight for, really fight for. So for selection, it's practical. I come up with this list. I do my own, I'm browsing on the internet, but I'm actually working. So I can see who's very active and going out in the field and hearing who's doing what. Blogs that are set up, interesting blogs that are not on our platform, our official platform. So working together with people outside of the archives is incredibly important. People who are the digital engagement group are very important. Yes, so in terms of then cataloguing it, we use AdLib. So it's an archival cataloguing tool, and that's been great fun, actually, to get everything together under our UNHCR funds, to enable search, to integrate it. And users, surprisingly, we've had people using it, because I've been led to believe that web archives is not very actively used, but I was surprised. So staff members have come looking for documents that have gone missing, because one of the big impetus for us to do web archiving was because our main site was changing. We were migrating the site, and that focused everybody's minds a lot and thinking on this. So some documentation did not come over to the new platform, which is correct, that was planned for. So we've had staff members coming back and asking for documentation, and pure researchers looking for web stuff on Iraq. You know, how researchers come and ask for stuff. So to do with this current situation, so we have a Twitter account from Iraq. That's it, I don't know. But access is a problem. So I believe that we need very strong tools now, text mining, or we need something better to interrogate the system. Catalogue is not enough. But in terms of awareness, our Deputy High Commissioner at the time was very interested in history, which is good, and archives, and really liked the idea of the web archiving project. So I was there at the right time, the right administration, because he's now changed, and they were quite enthusiastic about it, with a good business case presented, that it was for operational as well as historical reasons. So it's not just, history, it's nice, but it's also for operations, because, and I'll finish with this one, UNHCR is, I want to show you, in this current crisis, UNHCR of Syria and Iraq is not an implementer, it's a coordinator. So we have these data portals for every emergency that happens. And within each data portal, the NGOs that implement, so for water, for shelter, for gender issues, for sexual violence, they upload all their documents onto our data portal. So it's a library. And this content was not being collected by UNHCR, maybe managed by the NGOs, but as a completeness about this capture. So by capturing this between your Wayback Machine and UNHCR, we're capturing the collection of documentation that's coming in for each crisis that would not be kept in totality anywhere else. But our biggest challenge, I'm not finishing yet, our biggest challenge is quality assurance, without a doubt. Working with an outsourced partner is challenging, particularly this one. And technically, I think we're doing a good job. They're doing a good job. Project management-wise, we're very into project management. they're not so much. And so quality assurance is where we find it's the most time consuming part of our work. Because we want it to be operationally useful to staff in the field who we really want to support, as well as being a historically interesting document. We don't want to capture just look and feel. We want to capture a good quality web page, website. So that means documentation. And it takes a long time to QA, and that's our biggest challenge.
Okay, just keeping an eye on the time. We've got about 10 minutes for audience questions. So I'll put the I'll open the floor up to everyone sitting here. If anyone has any questions that they want to ask, I invite you to raise your hand, and we can get started. Yes? Yeah.
I have a question to the panel.
Okay,
members.
to ask a question, just push on the microphone in
It's
case
okay?
you haven't already.
Yes. I was wondering if some of you have been through the process of the ISO certification, which is the one that follows the OAIS guidelines for your different archives. So it's a bit, it's not exactly the same question, but than before, but in the same direction. Is do you feel that it's important to go through this certification for the long term?
I'll take it for sure. So the Internet Archive is not a trusted digital repository, and we don't intend to get that certification. We take many steps towards making sure that our environments are duplicated, and we check integrity over time of anything that we capture. Also, we have a lot of confidence in the robust work format as a preservation format. I think that in preservation, one of the most important things is establishing what the best preservation format is, and then once you have that, as you were saying earlier, it's just really making sure that you're a good custodian of the material. So as far as we're concerned, no, we're not working towards that TDR certification. Several of our partners do. That's also why we encourage that they download their own works and preserve them locally as well, especially if they value that TDR preservation.
Okay, does anybody else have a question? Oh, Tulio? Yeah?
I was wondering, are you developing tools to, so to say, make crowdsourcing possible as an effort to enrich the metadata or to as a source for ingestion of information about the material that you are archiving? I mean, describing is important for the purpose of retrieving, but maybe appealing to the people, I mean, to the crowd, to the wisdom of the crowd would, so to say, help to provide more context for a certain style of information. I don't know if I was clear. Crowdsourcing as a way of enriching what you're serving.
We actually don't do it. So I think it's an interesting idea, but we don't use it. So we really describe the data still very classic. So we do the catalog entry. We reuse metadata that our partners integrate. So it's a form they have to fill out in order to announce a website with us. So we're not going to redo the cataloging. We reuse metadata they enter, but we don't do any crowdsourcing for the data yet. This might also be a reason because we are not allowed to give free access to the Web Archive Switzerland because, as I said, we don't have a legal deposit. So actually, for every website we crawl, we have to ask the website owner if he can do it. Well, we don't do this because otherwise we would never end up with any content. But we send out an information. So we use an opt-out approach. So we send out an email for every website we want to crawl. We wait a few days until we hear anything, and if we don't hear anything, we start the crawl. But this, of course, that's why we only give restricted access. So it wouldn't be possible, actually, to put the Web Archive online and ask the whole Switzerland to add metadata to do this crowd funding sourcing of information. So this will be possible for the Web Archive, how it works right now, for legal reasons.
Well, Internet Archive, as I already mentioned in my talk, by nature, much of what we do is crowdsourcing, especially with regard to the archive itself and Wayback Machine and those global crawls. But also with the spontaneous collections that we build with Archive It and partners. When we call for submissions, we call for not only a website, but also metadata about that website. And so participants usually do provide quite a lot of metadata for those spontaneous collaborative collections.
Therese, did you still, or maybe we'll, Christine, thank you.
Yes, I have probably a very stupid question, but on the example that we see there on the screen, I was just wondering, how do you do this? Because if you create a web archive, as far as I understand, you create snapshots of a certain situation of pages at the day. But I suppose at the same time you have this database that you have created that you would also archive as a database, and if you do digital archiving at least. So is that not creating a conflict? What are you preserving then? The database or the database and the web pages, which could be, in a sense, conflicting with each other? I don't know how you do this.
Well, we've outsourced this. That's how we've done it. We've outsourced it to a company who do this for us. So they manage the works and they manage access for us. So I'd maybe hand it over to you in terms of what you do, because we don't.
I think.
Yeah.
One of the, I think, related to what Christine's asking. Correct me if I'm wrong, because in this case, what you've captured is a data portal. So there's the entry page where you can sort of see items that are listed, but then there's also the data and the documents that are accessed through this portal. So when you're web archiving, how do you capture both the web sort of presence, this web content, but then also the deeper content, the documents and things that are in the database that's behind this website?
Is that what you're asking? Yes. Yeah. I don't know how they do it. But they do it. That's what we wanted. So they capture the website and they capture the documentation. But as how they do it, I don't know. That's why I'm looking at Courtney. Yeah.
Well, I don't know in particular what they do, but so we, of course, would recommend that people would preserve the database as well. But you're right that when we're crawling, of course, we can get the document content because you naturally capture that when you're crawling, but it's still a snapshot at the time. And so best practice would be just to capture it very, very frequently so that you can look at each capture as it builds over time. But even then, you're not capturing the database. You're only capturing the documents.
Yeah, that's all we're
capturing. Yeah, exactly. So I see the conundrum that you're talking about. And there are lots of things. I mean, we at the Internet Archive, we just sponsored a summit called the Decentralized Web Summit. And the nature of many of the decentralized web technologies is that they're much more preservable because you can capture, it would be in essence that you could capture everything that you needed to run the website and the databases behind it, as sort of a package, which would be lovely, but we're not there yet.
So in terms of what we're capturing, nothing is deleted. It's incremental. It's added on. So we know the capture. We have all the documents from this document library. But we cannot search it. So you have to browse it. So we're only capturing documentation. You browse it by topic. So it's usable. Yeah. It's grand. We can find what we need. But once it gets bigger, it's going to be very unwieldy.
Okay, we're just about, Therese, yes?
Yeah, maybe this is a good closing question since we're here at the ITU and we have head of IS and Brie, you're representing our archiving unit. What are we doing at the ITU? It seems quite elaborate. It seems to require a lot of resources. It seems that you're operating on strategic points so that you can get the best for the resources that you have. Does that mean that we're losing all the rest that's not archived? Anders, Brie, please feel free to tell us where we are at the ITU.
it's a big question to answer with just a few minutes left. I think at this stage in the Library and Archives Service, it's an issue we're very aware of. It's something that we are discussing and certainly mindful of, but there's nothing actively being done at this point. I think it's a conversation that, or a series of conversations that need to take place, but right now there's nothing in place. But I think there's a lot of, we definitely have an awareness of the issue. And that's maybe, I don't know if Christine wants to add anything.
No, not especially. I mean, I can tell that the archives have been preserving materials from the ITU for many, many years, but those are basically print materials, of course, and we don't have any digital archiving in ITU, not talking about the web archiving, just in total digital archiving, because we produce a lot of information in a digital format and we don't archive that. And this is a real issue, and indeed, as Bree said, we are very well aware of this problem. I mean, when we say we, it's the people in the library and archives, and it's not so much outside that unit. I mean, a few people are aware of it, but I think we need a lot of more awareness about this problem in ITU.
Okay, it just makes me think, Anders, perhaps you can say something, because as we advocate for increasing paperless, what's the cost of this paperless if we don't have another policy in terms of preservation to go with it?
Thank you very much for the question. I know you are soon going on retirement. It would be pleasant. I can say there's not done much. It is about priorities of the organization. And I know that Christine has been trying to convince me, she's a part of my department, that we should do more. But I don't think we have really found any excellent solution today. We are going back to, what is it? You have gone back to the 1850. And it's fascinating, actually, to see the lovely material you can find with seals and stamps in the library. But I'm not sure that there is an awareness of the value of this. And I do agree with you that the last 20 years we are probably going to lose our history. And perhaps now it's the last 30 years. But also saying, coming from ITU, I just looked at a couple of other pieces of information which perhaps are going to come into the digital archives in the future. It says here, CIA is now using artificial intelligence to spy on the Earth, because we now take all the satellite images coming down. And the Internet of Things are going to come with, what would we say, 50 billion sensors? Is that also a part where we are going to have these things archived? It shows the location of the refugees. It shows the sentiments of the people's face. It shows the movement of the Earth. Is that what is going to come into the archives in the next 5-10 years?
Probably.
Yeah, I think that's a challenge for all of us. And I think one of the things I think of with the Internet Archive, I think it's such an amazing resource. But as Courtney discussed in her presentation, one of the things that is really key to building useful and meaningful collections of web content is to collaborate. That's one thing. But I think also, as information producing institutions and organizations, we have to take ownership over our content and select and identify these key things that will be important. So 20, 50, 100, 150 years from now, when people look back to see, for my example, what ITU is doing in 2016, that we've ensured that those resources that we feel have a lot of value and a lot of meaning to the work we're doing, that those are the things that are captured. So I think moving forward, working collaboratively, but also taking some initiative and taking control over the information we're creating, so that we don't end up with information everywhere and we don't really know what to look at and where to go to find to. Sure.
We are very clear that we can't capture everything in UNHCR, but if we document our selection decisions in our catalogue, so we know why we decided to choose these sites, what was the purpose. And also when we were preparing our business case for the global rollout of our EDMS and the web archive, it's funny, the higher up it got to the senior management, the smaller the business case got, until it was a matter of lines, 5 lines. This is what we're doing. And the thing was, we wrote at the very end was, under this administration, if you do not invest in this system, you will lose the record of this crisis. And the money came the next day.
That's reassuring to hear.
That wasn't the only business case. The business case was very elaborate.
Yeah.
That was one of the main points.
So it's 5:05, so we've gone 5 minutes over, but I wanted to thank everyone for taking the time, for coming and listening to this fantastic talk by Courtney, and interesting discussion by Barbara and Patricia about web archiving in action. So thank you again, and wish you all a good evening.